queen this way, and he's gotten a piece, and he's only had to take white's queen with a pawn, and this is a huge advantage. And at this point, black is up 6-5, or actually 7-5 if you count the promoted piece, and so black should be winning that. So that's the reason for the popularity of c5 cd. The problem is this move e4 e5, which we saw in several games that we looked at. And the question of the last move is what made this series so hard to find. On the one hand, black threatens e6, queen g5, queen c1, queen d1, and if he can play this series, he's generally doing very well. But he also threatens another way to get the queen off, which is e6, d3, dc, cd. So back in 1998, there was a lot of focus on this f4, e4, e5 series, with the idea that when black played e6 to stop mate, d3, dc, cd, white would play king d1, f5, bishop g5, bishop takes d8. He was happy that black moved his e-pawn. And then some last move, knight f3 was the most popular, but you would have to analyze bishop h4, bishop a5, all these different tries for spare moves here. But it turns out that this should be a simple loss. It looks better than it is. It threatens checkmate in so many lines, but it turns out all black really has to do is take the pieces in front of him and deliver check, and he'll be able to survive this swarm attempt. The solution here is just to get the king safe for 3 moves and then deliver check. Knight e3 check, and black is up 6 pieces to 5, and just delivering check slows the game down to where black is going to win on the 8. Just some example series, if white tries something like king d2, king e3, b4, b5, bc, cb, ba, even with mostly full squares around his king, mostly empty squares around his king, he gets mated to a pattern like bishop e4, bishop e1, bishop a6, bishop e2, d5, rook b8, rook b4, rook e4, stuff like this, which is a pretty mate. And I'm not going to go through all the theory that we looked at there, but it looks like f4, e4, e5 actually loses for white, even though it's incredibly difficult to find the series. You might have to spend hours trying to refute one of black's tries. Again, the main idea behind this f4 is to stop this e6, queen g5, queen c1, queen d1. So I came up with this idea back near 2000 or 1998, I guess it was, to play bishop d2. The idea here is that I didn't want to waste time going f4, f5, and black still doesn't have this queen g5, queen c1, queen d1 idea. So we thought this just won for white. But again, this shows the incredible complexity of progressive chess and of c5, c takes d4 in particular. Black went e6, d3, cd1. The idea here was king d1, bishop a5, bishop d8, bishop e7, bishop f8. So this was the main idea here, was to actually get rid of 2 pieces, get rid of the queen and another piece when black played this series. But it turns out he probably actually has a defense here, which is to play knight f6, knight h5, knight g3, knight takes h1, rook takes f8, knight takes f2 check. And he's up 5 to 4 pieces, he delivers check, and we found some almost draws, where white was almost managing to hang on. So this may be worth looking at if the other series doesn't pan out. I just present this to kind of give the history of the variation, but I think the current theoretical best that absolutely squashes c5, c takes d4 is e4, e5, a4, as I showed in the section on anticipation. Black doesn't try to prevent white's moves, and he gets a useful move in, so instead of playing bishop d2 just to stop this one line and then have to go bishop a5, d8, e7, f8, he'll be up a very strong tempo now that will checkmate if black tries that other line. For example, e6, d3, cd to check, and now king d1, bishop g5, bishop d8, bishop e7, bishop a8. The same idea, but white is up a full tempo, and now this series doesn't work if black tries this idea. Then he gets checkmated. It's a relatively easy checkmate to see. It simply takes 7 moves. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so I'm wrong here. I had the wrong series looking at my notes. It's obvious here that this idea with rook takes f8 does get mated pretty easily on c8 with just like knight c3, knight d5, rook c1, rook c8. So the actual try with bishop d2, e4, e5 was actually d5, bishop g4, bishop d1, e6. And now if white tries this idea of, then in this position, knight f6, h5, knight g3, knight h1, rook f8, and knight takes f2 check. So this is actually the refutation of bishop d2, e4, e5. We think, even though it's only a material equality in the sense of 4 pieces to 4, but black has 2 rooks guarded by check defense, and it turns out he also has a ton of pawns, promotable threats. He delivered a harassing check, and this is the theoretical line where we could not find a win for white, or even a way to hold the position. It looked like he was just barely losing in this position, and again, that theory goes very deep. So you guys can look at it, or if anybody wants any more detail on any of this, you can just ask me. So that's the history, but then it turns out that e4, e5, a4 just stops those ideas cold because of these various threats. Like one of the problems with now with d5, bishop g4, bishop d1 is that white is very fast to checkmate with rook c8 ideas. And f7 is also weak in this position. And so there's the idea of just, for example, bishop e2, bishop h5, e6, bishop takes f7. But if we play e6 here, then we can see one of the main points of a4 is rook a3, rook c3, rook c8, bishop g5, rook takes d8. Notice that we could not get this from bishop d2, e4, e5. That's why that series is alive against bishop d2, e4, e5. But this gets mated here. So the only try with bishop g4, bishop d2, bishop d1 that we could find was to play this queen a5 check. But then it runs into this whole b4, ba5. King d1, bishop a3, e6 was our idea. This really stuffs black. This is a great use of spare moves. You know, the dangling pawn is such a menace, and the bishop on a3 is actually really strong too. And black just has nothing here. He's just completely stuffed. His development's terrible. He can't get any of this stuff off. And it's not surprising that this should be the case, because c5 cd doesn't develop the king field any. So there's a lot of mating ideas. But let's talk about the main anticipation, which I talked about in the section on anticipation, is if he does try e6, queen g5, queen c1, queen e1, instead of trying to prevent this series, we simply anticipate it and refute it. So king d1, a5, a6, ab, bc, and this is just crushing because we reincarnated our queen, and I haven't found anything for black here. If anybody has any suggestions, all I can see to do is to take the queen on c8. And finally, if black does try this idea of e6, d3, dc, cd, then just as in bishop d2, a4, a5, I had that position wrong earlier, but this is just this was a complete win. This was probably a win for white, even with the pawn on a2. As we saw, there's just so many mating threats, and I don't see how black really gets out of this. And with the pawn on a4, it's even worse. There really just isn't any try at all. About all he can do is take this bishop off and make some moves to get his king safe. But then white has just has overwhelming advantage with the rook and the a pawn and equal piece count. So that's probably the end of that. For a while we thought that this series might be good. Queen b6, queen takes d8. But then we found this idea of just swarming with king d8, knight f6, d5, d4, and this has seemed to be really strong. The idea of formerly a lot of people had played in previous games as bishop h3, bishop g2, bishop h1, taking the rook, but we found a nice series to refute that idea. I won't go into all the theory of that since this video is already long, and a4, e4, e5 seems to just crush this series. Uh, so so really, what we get into is that there seems to be a drawback to most moves that you play in progressive chess. So just finding the drawback and exploiting it enables you, with common sense moves that eat material, should be enough. But now we get into series where Black responds to d4 and actually is in the game. He might have been in the game with knight c6. It wouldn't surprise me if knight c6 draws. It's very tough. You're making it harder on yourself. H5 is interesting, and C6, in my opinion, is the main line of all of progressive chess. With H5, the main idea is, notice he hasn't guarded against this mate we talked about earlier. So on bishop F4, bishop C7, bishop D8, and again bishop G5, bishop E7, bishop D8 is an option in all of these too. So it shows how you kind of have to check everything. And for example, here we have to play bishop e2, bishop d1, because if we took the c-pawn, we're getting mated to this rook c8 configuration. So in this case, we have to do this, but we're gambling that if white plays a series like bishop a6, bishop b7, bishop a8, king d1, king e2, we're a tempo faster on promoting. Our main idea was to promote something, and since we played h5 anticipating this line, we kind of gained that tempo back. And so h5, h4, hg, gh, queen. And at this point, we gain a tempo, in fact, to play queen e4 check, and this does not appear to get mated. So the question remains if black is winning here, or if white actually has a good response. I actually think black is probably winning that position, and this shows the importance of the spare move. So going back, we can see that king d2 is probably a better try, hoping to prove that this is an example of where the king wants to get off the back rank, because he's anticipating a pawn promotion where he wants to be able to play like knight c3, knight f3, or knight a3, knight e2, in some sort of configuration where he moves the knight someplace where rook takes h1. So he's anticipating the series, and that he'll gain a tempo by having the king off the back rank. The downside is he has to make sure he's not walking into checks. And indeed, here with the king on d2, if we suppose there's a standing mate threat on c8, so black does probably have to move his king. H takes g2, g takes h1, queen. And now trying to find a last move is hard here, because queen takes g1 invites knight c3 and then a massive rook munch, where white takes all black's pieces. So this is a case where you sometimes don't want to take the extra piece. You want when you make a piece of major material like a queen, you want to make white have to lose, the other side have to lose time trying to take her. So this is kind of the open theoretical question here. Is this is kind of inflexible, moving this h pawn on move 2, because if white has arranged his pieces where the h pawn doesn't do as much damage, then then he can't. Then white is doing well. In other words, c6 was really a more flexible move in many ways. Because it leaves black's options open as to promote a pawn on the queen side, the king side, wherever is the best choice. But going back, if black doesn't promote this pawn, it's hard to see what it is that he'll do. I mean, yeah, maybe he can deliver a check with like knight e4, but if he doesn't take material, then this won't work. He still has to spend at least one move getting his king safe, and so that's part of his problem. He really has to take at least one of the white rooks this time. So you could try something with like the rook on h8, doing something like rook h6, g6, g2, g1, h1.